We heard in our first reading this phrase said over and over: the body is not for immorality. It's always one of those topics that's a little bit difficult to preach about, because I think in our Christian tradition, whenever we hear preachers speaking of sin or immorality, very often it's used and abused to try to manipulate people, to try to shame them or guilt them or belittle them in some way, shape, or form. So if you'll allow me, let me take a moment and talk about immorality. I believe we have lost a sense of sin. And I don't know how hard you have to go looking if you were to wander outside the walls of this sacred space to see examples of what that looks like. Our culture, especially on college campuses, you just don't have to look very far for ways in which it seems as if people have lost a sense of sin. But it isn't just limited to college campuses. I think our entire culture seems to have lost a sense of sin, a sense of right and wrong. So often the conversation about right and wrong has been co-opted by people in the political sphere to try to manipulate us in a different way and advance their own power-hungry agenda. But here's the problem, I think, that's even more pressing. I think we faithful Christians, you and I, we too have lost a sense of sin. Or at least the way in which Scripture would tell us to think about immorality. Because here's the problem. If you're anything like me, you were probably raised to think of sin as a violation of some moral rule or some moral law. That the whole of morality was dictated by a long list of do this and don't do that. And that was it, right? It was a simply set of laws and rules, and maybe you even had some nuns in your life who enforced them. I'm still old enough with the gray hair, you can tell. I did have nuns in my grammar school. They were wonderful. But the stereotype is still fun to share in a homily. So the thing is this. What does Scripture say about morality and immorality? What's really going on? If I'm going to be so audacious as to stand in front of you and say, we have lost a sense of sin, what's the right way to understand sin? Well, think about the 10 Commandments. The very first commandment is the commandment against idolatry. The commandment against having other gods before the one true God. Of worshiping, the commandment against worshiping false gods. And if you were to read Scripture, and I mean really read it, rather than just simply skimming it or looking for phrases that agree with what you already thought, if you really read what it says, all sin is a symptom of idolatry. It's not that idolatry is one of those sins in the long list of sins, like idolatry is one sin, murder is another sin, lying is yet another sin. No. There's only one sin, and it's idolatry. And if you commit other sins, it's a symptom of an idolatry problem. So if you're worshiping a false god, and you commit a particular sin in worshiping that false god, then it's one of those other sins. Does this make sense? Do you see what I'm saying? And this is what it looks like. See, we 21st century Americans, we think of ourselves as free of superstitions and very sophisticated and very intelligent. So all of the false gods of the Bible, we thought we've banished all of them. We ignore them. They're not real. But yet the problem is, just because we've forgotten them doesn't mean we're no longer worshiping them. You see, our culture is obsessed with worshiping the ancient gods. It's just we don't use their same names. We still worship the false idols of war, of money, of sexual pleasure. We still worship the false god of ourself. We've come up with a new god, by the way, technology. Now, the names of some of these gods, the ancient names, Mars, the god of war, Aphrodite, the god of erotic love, Mammon, that's one Jesus made up, the god of wealth and luxury and riches. Our culture so drastically worships false idols that there are consequences for this. And believe me, if you read the Old Testament, it's in there. God warns his people over and over. There's consequences for worshiping false gods. Mainly two consequences. If you worship a false god, you will become like the god you worship. So we know the old phrase, right? You are what you eat. I'm fat because I like chicken wings. I eat lots of them, right? We understand that biologically. But in the spiritual realm, you become like the God that you worship. And all gods other than the one true living God, all gods are dead. So to worship a false god is to become spiritually dead. This is why Paul in the second reading is so focused on immorality in the body, because the body is about life. And immorality, sin, is very much about death. If you worship a dead god, a false god, you will become dead. But there's one other terrible consequence. If you worship a false god, the false god, all of them, demand human sacrifice. We're familiar, maybe, I hope, you paid attention in history class in high school, of the ways in which different cultures and different pagan religious ceremonies would kill hundreds of humans and sacrifice to false gods. Think of the Aztecs and their incredible number of human sacrifices. You may have seen pictures or artwork depicting this. And sometimes we're so arrogant to think that our culture is free of that. That we are advanced enough, moral enough, good enough, that our culture doesn't have human sacrifice. But here's the problem. Our culture does worship the god of war. And what happens? If you worship the god of war, people have to die, because the god of war demands that you solve your problems through military might, through bullets and bombs. Our culture worships the god of mammon, the god of money, the god of wealth. And that god demands that money be far more important than people. So what are the consequences? The poor cry out for justice and suffer tremendously. The unborn children in the womb are very routinely killed for economic reasons. Because our culture says we can't afford to provide the care needed for scared mothers to be able to raise and educate their children without continuing the cycle of poverty. So the god of wealth demands the human sacrifice of unborn children. This Friday is the anniversary of Roe versus Wade. We have slaughtered tens of millions of children on the altar of the god of Mammon. But not only Mammon's altar, but the altar of Aphrodite. The altar that says to us that the highest good is every form of physical pleasure and fulfilling every physical desire. It's incredible. We so profoundly worship the god of Aphrodite that you, young people, you're told, actively you are told, that the only way for you to be fully who you are meant to be is by giving in to every urge and desire that you may have. And in so doing, to investigate your true self. These are the messages of the false gods of our world. There are plenty others, but I don't want to preach all morning. I've got to limit myself. But see, this is the heart and soul of morality according to the scriptural view of the world. Because here's the thing that I haven't said yet. Worship isn't just what you do for an hour on Sunday morning. Worship, according to Scripture, is what you do with your whole life. Your highest priority in life is what you worship. That thing, that God that takes up your imagination, that takes up your passion, your creativity, your daydreams, your effort, your energy, your talents. That which your life is oriented towards, that is your God. That is who you worship. And yes, we don't use the ancient names of Mars, Mammon, or Aphrodite any longer. But that doesn't mean that our culture doesn't worship them. And so if we're going to understand what Paul is writing about in the first letter to the Corinthians, we've got to let Scripture remind us of what the problem of sin is in the first place. We also, as an aside, and I hope you hear the consequences of this in the realms of politics, we have to stop letting political parties tell us that they're the ones who really stand for morality and the Christian faith. They're lying to us. They don't. None of them do. Stop believing it right now. No more. Because the problem is, in some way, shape, or form, everyone who longs for power in our world is, in some way, worshiping a false god. And so the consequences are spiritual death and human sacrifice. I know it's grim. This is not one of my favorite homilies. I don't get any warm fuzzies off of telling you this, and I doubt you do either. But we've got to be able to challenge ourselves and to renew our minds so that we no longer think of immorality as simply just a violation of a long list of rules. When you were 5, that long list of rules was helpful, but not anymore. Now you've got to understand that the worship of God is about the central priority of your life. And if it's the one true God, then you'll live. Both flourish as a human being, but also spiritually live vibrantly. But if you go after and worship a God that isn't the one true God, then in your life there will be compromises, there will be little deaths along the way, and someone, somewhere, it might be you, will be sacrificed on the altar of a false god. This is what is the central problem. If you want to summarize the central issue of what's broken in our society, this is it. Our whole culture is organized around the worship of false gods. Now, you can share this with people outside this room, and they probably won't agree with you. But according to the way that Scripture reads our world, this is what the Bible would tell us as the way to read what's going on in our world. This is how St. Paul would challenge us to read our world. And I think if we take this seriously, it finally liberates us from the political manipulation of all those who want to talk about morality so that we might put them in power. We can finally be free of those political lies that want to use morality language to somehow get us to support them. Now we've got the biblical set of language, the biblical lens to see what's going on in our world. Now we've got the true understanding of how to fix our world and to bring about a culture of life.